Deidre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Bowman. A pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I started my speech with a sentence. It's about respect. Now, I'm sad to say I've heard precious little respect today from those members who have spoken to Scotland, or indeed to its elected representatives, and I'm very sorry about that. There's been a lot of mention made of the independence referendum, and I wonder, just in terms of the promises that were kept to the Scottish people by those who galloped up over the border in the closing weeks before that referendum was held, the promises made to them, and there's been a lot of talk about grievance and gripe. I wonder what members make of those many people who are in Scotland, not simply the SNP, although of course that's makes up a considerable part of the population, but those people who live in Scotland who are very annoyed and upset that those promises that were made to them in the run-up to that independence referendum, promises like protection of HMRC jobs, for example, staying in the EU, as I mentioned before, shipbuilding jobs protected, and a vow, frankly, that falls far short of what is commonly meant by home rule. And that was very much sold to the people of Scotland. So I would urge members to bear that in mind when they're addressing SNP members. Yes, of course.
Michael Gove.
Would the Honourable Grady enlighten us as to what the view of Lord Smith of Kelvin, the keeper of the vow, was about the decision of this Westminster Parliament to honour it? Did he agree that it had been honoured?
The member brings up Lord Smith. I can tell you that there were certainly members of that committee who were unhappy with the way that was done, and there were certainly aspects of that Scotland Bill. Many members voted on the amendments, members in the House of Commons from our party. None of those got through. None of them were actually accepted as amendments until they went through to the unelected House of Lords, which is laughable. If I may just return to my speech, because I'm conscious of time. So, getting back to this all being about respect. This is about politicians, monarchs and bureaucrats understanding and accepting that powers lie with the people we serve, not with us. It's about knowing that that colossus that bestrides the world stage is people power, and that those who lead are servants of the people, not masters. That's what the claim of right is. It's a declaration that the people are sovereign, as has been mentioned, and it's in their gift to decide how that sovereignty should be used. Governments and parliaments rule only with the consent of the people and exist only because the people allow them to. It is a reality that politicians forget at their peril. Now, I think it's important to note a very clear difference between the attitude towards Parliament struck in Scotland and that struck in England, a point of difference which I understand is also noted in the legal concept of sovereignty in each nation. Whilst there's a belief in England, an English tradition with historical precedent, in the absolute sovereignty of Parliament, there is no such belief in Scotland. The Scots' attitude, as has been mentioned, and constitutional law, if my learned friends would confirm, is that sovereignty rests with the people. That is a principle that is embedded in the 1320 Declaration of Arbroath, where the king and future kings were warned that if they displeased the people, then the people would elect another king, more like a president than a king, I suppose. And it is a principle that is embedded in the claim of right. It is actually a principle, and it's not quite right that no conservatives have ever acknowledged that principle. That principle was acknowledged by the current chair of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee during a debate in the House on May 22nd, 1997, when he said, "The ultimate sovereignty of the Scottish and Welsh peoples is a fact. Whatever the niceties of international law, Scotland and Wales can claim the right of self-determination if that is what they want." Now, it took a bit of time from the publication of the Claim of Right to the interim solution with the creation of a devolved administration. But 10 years is nothing in the great scheme of things, and in the march of nations, it's but a blink of an eye. I have to say, though, the Conservatives have quite a lot to thank the Claim of Right and Scottish devolution for. It saved their party. In fact, the current Scottish Secretary owes his political career to the Scottish Parliament. There were very few opportunities for Tory politicians in Scotland, even those who had been SDB councillors. And the proportional representational element of the Scottish electoral system revived a frankly dying party which had ironically opposed its creation in the first place. Democracy, properly energised, does give some strange, interesting and unexpected results. That claim of right was democracy in action. It rose from Civic Scotland, from the churches and the trades unions and small businesses and organisations of length and breadth of the country in a demand to address the democratic deficit that arose from being governed by a government which couldn't command support in Scotland. It's interesting to note John Major's government had 14% of the members representing Scottish seats, while this government has a bit less than 2%. So there is work still to be done in removing that democratic deficit from Scotland and rendering those of us who are Scots MPs redundant. So, as I say, independence, from our view, is the logical end point for the journey that the Scottish Constitutional Convention set out on. And it's interesting that the original convention refused to countenance the possibility. There's been some mention of that, but I'm told that that is why the SNP stepped away from the convention. Now, it was some years before my time in the party, but I'm told that the prospect of devolution caused great debate about whether it was good for Scotland or not, but that the refusal to even discuss independence in the convention was the final straw. My much older and grizzled colleagues will be able to correct the record if I have misspoken in that respect. They have long and very detailed memories. The claim of right, then, resting on the principle that the people are sovereign and imbued with a notion of changing the form of government to address a democratic deficit, has, of course, a resonance now, an increased resonance. In June, the UK voted to leave the EU, Scotland did not. 52% of UK voters voted leave, and 62% of Scottish voters voted remain. Untimely ripped from the European Union were we. The democratic deficit remains stark, real and unrelenting. The conditions that necessitated the claim of right and the creation of the devolved administration and parliament in Edinburgh remain. There is but one answer which will address that deficit and Scotland's needs. One simple, elegant solution: the dissolution of the UK, Scottish independence, and the creation of good neighbours as separate nations. No one has the right to fix the boundary to the march of a nation. No one can tell a country this far and no further. The ultimate sovereignty of the Scottish and Welsh peoples is a fact. Scotland's march goes on and independence beckons.
Yeah. Peter Grant, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen. I think that's us quits for the time that he became me when this debate was originally tabled. I've maybe misunderstood something from the reading that I've done to refresh myself about the various claims of right for Scotland, and from listening to presumably the person who knew about it because he led the debate. I thought the claim of right for Scotland was about the people. And all we've heard from the Better Together benches has been about political parties, about governments, about political leaders. There's been precious little about the people. I still don't know whether either of the speakers from the Conservative benches actually agree with the sacrosanct fact that sovereignty in Scotland resides with the people, that the people have the right to decide, and that the people have the right. Well, if the honourable member is going to confirm that he agrees 100% with the right of the Scottish people to decide for themselves, I'll happily give way.
Peter Grant.
Well, there we have it. Given an explicit opportunity, one of the few Conservatives that could be bothered turning up to this debate has refused point blank to recognise what has been established. Has refused point blank to accept what has been established in our nation for just a shade, well, since 1320, that sovereignty resides with the people. And I can't help wondering how much less of a constitutional bourach would England be in right now if they had a fundamental acceptance of the sovereignty of the people. We spent 3 hours in here yesterday talking about, I think misguided, but very understandable demand from over 4 million people to set some kind of threshold, to have some kind of rerun of the European Union referendum because they were so bitterly disappointed at the result. And a lot of the argument was constitutional niceties about, does Parliament have the right to ignore that? Does Parliament have the right to hold another referendum until it keeps getting the right result? Does Parliament have the right to just say we're staying in the European Union anyway? And fundamentally the answer is nobody really knows, because England doesn't have the benefit of a clear statement as to where constitutional sovereignty really and ultimately lies.